So, we'll turn my camera off. I hope you can see me. I would say we start. We're still waiting for more participants, but we shouldn't be punishing those who have been on time. So very briefly, my name is Katrin Heidbrink, and I'm going to be the process facilitator today. We also have a panel facilitator whom I'll introduce later on. Just very briefly, I believe you all know this, or some of this, as announced in this in the invitation. This webinar is being simultaneously translated into French and English. Most of the presentations and most of the panel discussion will be held in English with simultaneous interpretation into French and Spanish. Some panel contributions will be in French and also ultimately translated into or interpreted into English and Spanish. The chat is open throughout the webinar. And please, we ask you to please put the settings in the chat to send messages to everyone, not just to hosts and panelists. We will not respond directly. Hosts and panelists will not respond directly in this line of the chat. So please post to everyone. And later on, I will explain that again. So of course you can discuss throughout the webinar, but comments and questions in the chat to the panelists, for example, will be compiled by the ABS team, the initiative team, and presented to panelists for discussion. So that's that. Now I would like to hand the floor over to Hartmut Meyer, and I will briefly stop sharing so you can see or see Hartmut, and then I will turn on share the screen again for your slides. Hartmut.
Yes, thanks, Katrin, and I'm happy that we can again meet with so many people in one of our webinars on DSI. And Katrin, could you show the slides? Then I can introduce it.
Again, yes. The slide is here. There we go.
Okay. Well, I'm very briefly give an overview about our work as it focuses on DSI. And I think that many of you are following our webinars since quite a time. So we started as an initiative to work on digital sequence information in 2019 already in the context of the South African-Norwegian Environmental Partnership. And the funding for this work has been renewed recently and also broadened. And now the DSI work, which is funded by Norway, it also includes the Meridian Institute from the US, which also conducts several events and webinars, and more or less we work on a common work plan this year, at least until to the COP15 in Cali. Because these webinars we undertake on DSI and also the dialogues and other meetings are highly relevant and of course connected to the ongoing negotiations. We closely also cooperate with the Secretariat of the CBD and with the co-chairs of the various negotiation groups. In the past, we had several technical webinars on many topics which were relevant and important in the discussion on commercial use of DSI, the role of the IPLCs, capacity development for DSI traceability, etc. And as I just mentioned in the beginning, we have a very long series now of dialogues. During Corona, we even did this in a very challenging online format, which was also an interesting experience. But luckily now we are back to physical meetings. So the fifth of these dialogues will be convened in Johannesburg in September of this year. And the initiative also published some information material, a video on DSI, and of course, you find all that on our webpage, which is currently, or which will be renewed in a very short time, so that this wealth of material are also, let's say, well sorted, and you can find for what you search. Okay, so this is more or less our short introduction, our work. Can you show the next slide, please? Yeah, that's the agenda for today. So we will give you a background information on this non-monetary benefit sharing, a subject which is amongst, I also guess, the what discussed topics at the negotiations, and we didn't work on that until now. And then we will have a panel with practitioners, persons from science, from public and private science, who have experiences in this non-monetary benefit sharing. And that, I think, with that panel, we will go into depth and explore some questions and hopefully give a lot of answers for that. And as already said, Zuel and me will screen the chat, and then out of that, put some questions to the panel in the end. And then the last slide for this introduction.
I think that's just the technical issues. Do you want to do that, or I
Yeah,
can do that?
no, you can also do that. Yeah.
Okay, then. Thank you, Hartmut.
Okay.
And I'll just move on.
Oh, I forgot. Sorry. We have the closing reflections by Preston Hardinson. Sorry, I forgot that. He's representing the IPLCs in the DSI negotiation, and I think that's also will be interesting closing of our webinar for today. Okay.
Thank you very much, Hartmut. So, here we are again. Now, I've said part of this already. So for the chat, as I said, it's open throughout the webinar. You can discuss, but of course, we encourage you to listen to the panel discussion. Again, please remember to send to everyone when you type your comments and questions in the chat. The chat itself will not be translated. If you want to do that, you could use a tool such as DeepL. You can also Google it and find it. It's a very good translation tool, or of course, Google Translate. It has already been said that the initiative will screen the chat and then present aggregated clusters of questions and comments to the panelists for discussion. Obviously, with so many participants and always limited time, there will be some remaining questions and comments that we might not be able to address today, but we will always use them and inform to inform and orientate future webinars and other events. Please also note that for data protection reasons, participants cannot copy or save the chat, but an anonymized version of the chat discussion will be part of the webinar report. Those who've participated in earlier webinars know how we do that, so that the content is transparent, but not who said what. Okay, with this, I think we are ready to go to the content, and I will briefly stop sharing again to give Suhail the chance to at least briefly show himself, or I will show him. Let me see, here is Spotlight for everyone. Hello, Suhail.
Yes, good time of the day from Germany. And I'm Suhail Al-Janabi, also with the ABS Capacity Development Initiative, and I would like to provide a little bit of background on the topic and where we're coming from in relation to the discussion on non-monetary benefit sharing. All right. So this is what we all should know, where we're coming from. So that DSI, as we know, has been discussed within the CBD already since 2016, and it got a bit more talk than 2018 with this decision to think about how to address DSI in the context of the global biodiversity framework, and then also through the ad hoc to the ARTEC, there were then options for operational terms and key areas for capacity building developed next. Basically now what we have in the center is at COP15, the decision on multilateral system for DSI with benefit sharing, and that there's a time-bound process until 2016 that benefits from the use of DSI should be shared fairly and equitably, and that a multilateral mechanism for benefit sharing from the use of DSI should be part of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. At the same time, of course, also in other fora, we know that DSI is being dealt with under WIPO with respect to standard in patent applications. There is an agreement under BBNJ that DSI benefit sharing should feed into a multilateral system. At the level of the WHO, the PIP framework is in place, but there are further negotiations ongoing with respect to multilateral pathogen and genomic data benefit sharing. And also, of course, within the agricultural sector under the treaty, DSI is an issue, whereas, of course, so far, no text proposal has been put on the table. Next. So, yes, and what comes out, next, please, of COP is in particular the decision 15/9 that we all know, and there in particular the criteria that should guide us now in the establishment of the multilateral benefit sharing mechanism. We called it 9+1. So it is on efficiency, feasibility, practicality, that it should generate more benefits than costs, effectiveness, the clarity and legal clarity for providers and users should be taken into account, not hindering research and innovation, consistency with open access to data. It should not be incompatible with international legal obligations, mutual supportiveness with other benefit sharing instruments, IPLCs to be taken into account with respect to the traditional knowledge and of the genetic resource that they hold. And that is what we call the +1, that the monetary and also the non-monetary benefits, the topic of our webinar today, should be used to support conservation, sustainable use of biodiversity, ideally and inter alia through indigenous peoples and local communities. So this is what guides us in 15.9. Next, but there are, of course, also further considerations. And I don't want to get now through all these 16 topics. Next, please. There are two that are very related to our today's webinar. So there is the non-monetary benefit sharing, including the possibility of information on geographical origin as a criteria for non-monetary benefit sharing deriving from COP, and also capacity development and technology transfer, where we know that these terms are quite often linked or encompassed in non-monetary benefit sharing in discussion. So that's what we got from COP. Next. We had then, as we all recall, within the open-ended working group in Geneva in November last year, an annex, probably the most important part of what came out of Geneva, which then identifies possible elements of a multilateral mechanism, benefit sharing from the use of DSI, and including a global fund. There were 5 categories: contributions to the fund, disbursements from the fund, non-monetary benefit sharing, our topic, governance, and relation to other approaches and systems. And all these elements here were split into, subdivided into elements on which there is potential convergence in future in the development of the system, but also elements where there is a need for further discussion. Next, and now diving a little bit deeper into what we brought from Geneva in terms of elements for further discussion when talking about non-monetary benefit sharing. So there are divergent views, need for discussion on the question whether there is a need for a new platform or facility or modalities with respect to non-monetary benefit sharing. Should the needs of stakeholders be a criterion for this benefit sharing? Then whether non-monetary benefit sharing should include, for example, projects for conservation, sustainable use of biodiversity, whether and if to what extent protection and maintenance of traditional knowledge, innovations, practices of IPLCs, farmers, women, and also in relation to the country of origin should be considered. Whether and to what extent technology transfer and development should be part of it. Whether and to what extent making the product available in the public domain or licensing of products free of charge could be an element of non-monetary benefit sharing. Also, need for further discussion on training on the conservation and sustainable use of genetic diversity or associated traditional knowledge. So we were at the elements for further discussion from Geneva, which then includes, of course, the question of the establishment of national databases, whether and to what extent also whether non-monetary benefit sharing should promote joint research partnerships, whether the 2020 RTEC on DSI that provided guidance on capacity building and development should be taken into account, and whether or not and to what extent the use of DSI should be a trigger for non-monetary benefit sharing. So all this is in the discussion pipeline. But from Geneva, next slide, please, there's also a list of topics for potential convergence. And so there is, for example, that there is convergence that additional capacity for the purposes of conservation, sustainable use could be an element of it, that it should address the capacity gaps between developed and developing countries, particularly, of course, to generating, access, use, and analyzing and storing DSI, that the self-identification of needs by IPLCs, women and youth, as major contributors to conservation sustainable use should be taken into account, the needs of national agencies and institutions, including research and academic institutions. And that's now in the context, of course, of the broader discussions of the convention, that capacity building, development, technology transfer in relation to DSI should contribute to the implementation and ongoing work of the CBD provisions on technical and scientific cooperation, particular with respect to decision 15.8. And that includes then needs assessment, the NBSUP process, and the sub-regional and regional support centers for technical and scientific cooperation. There's also some general guidance with the so-called high-level goals on capacity building and development and technology transfer for conservation, sustainable use, that it should improve the ability to manage and conserve biodiversity and use it sustainably, that it should contribute to closing the gap between developed and developing countries. That it should also deliver to national priorities in relation to capacity building and capacity development, scientific cooperation, and should also support enabling capacities as well as research infrastructure, and that target beneficiaries of these programs should be IPLC, women, youth, and government and researchers. And that lessons learned from what happened so far, of the many ways in which non-monetary benefits are already being shared, that this should be taken into account within the conceptualization of the future sharing of non-monetary benefits. But we also got from COP, as you recall, two key features, which is the goal C and the target 13 of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, the so-called Biodiversity Plan. Here we do see that digital sequence information is covered in both. In goal C, we have an explicit mentioning of non-monetary benefits in that regard, where in target 13, it's rather benefits in a broader scale. It is in accordance with applicable international access and benefit sharing instruments. So it's not only the CBD we have to look at. And the big question is, of course, in that regard, how do we make this operational next? How do we bring this into the monitoring framework of the Global Biodiversity Framework? Because, of course, we see it. Non-monetary benefit sharing is an integral part of it. It's not explicit on DSI, but implicit. And with that, we are facing all the challenge, of course, of the indicator development. There is so far an open mentioning of that for both goal and target, there should be an indicator on non-monetary benefits developed. But of course, there is no real grips yet how this is going to be done. In this regard, the Secretariat of the CBD commissioned a study on access and benefit sharing indicators. And here, Amber Scholz from the German Collection of Microorganisms and Cell Cultures will give us a little heads up on the study and what we may expect. Amber.
Yeah, thanks, Suhail. I appreciate that. And you can move on to the next slide. So this is just a little teaser or a trailer for a webinar that will be coming up in about 3 weeks. And just to help frame the discussion that's about to be held on non-monetary benefits, the study really kind of starts with 3 important messages. First, as Suhail kind of indicated, there is a transition that you see between target 13 and goal C, namely that target 13 focuses a lot on the measurement of successful ABS policy implementation and doing so by 2030. However, looking ahead to goal C, you see that the language that negotiators developed moves to measuring benefits shared. And of course, this is super interesting for this community because while we have good tools to measure policy, laws created, legislation drafted, we don't actually have great tools in ABS to measure benefits shared. So that's the first thing. We need a transition from policy to benefits. Point number 2, and also Suhail has mentioned this, that ABS, just like every other target and goal, has to be aggregated across all relevant instruments. So in this context, the UN General Assembly on the 19th of December of last year issued a resolution 78/155 that calls for an aggregation across all environmental instruments. And so in this case, the BBNJ agreement, the plant treaty, and potentially also the World Health Organization, as well as the CBD and all of its benefit sharing instruments, the Nagoya Protocol, and now here for today, the DSI instrument, will all need to be added up across each other. And so you can imagine already the study lays out a lot of thinking about how do we measure the same things across all of these instruments to provide this aggregate set. This means ultimately, and thinking about it here for the panel discussion, we will need a core set of indicators that all ABS instruments have in common. And the very last thing before I tell you about the whole study is that to that extent, for non-monetary benefit sharing, the Nagoya Protocol, for example, lists 17 kinds of non-monetary benefits. And in the study, we make a proposal to do 5 categories because it's unrealistic to have 17 different kinds of indicators. So we call for 5 categories. Number 1, the sharing of information and research results. Number 2, scientific collaboration and or joint publications. Topic 3, capacity building, capacity development and or training. Number 4, access to and transfer of technology. And number 5, sustainable development benefits. And in the study, we lay out what relevant indicators could be for each of those 5 categories and call for all ABS instruments, where possible, to contribute to those 5 categories. So a final logistics note, the study should be up online on the 15th of April. It will be provided as an INF document in advance of Substem. And the ODTEC that Suhail mentioned, for which the study was sent to or through, will be inviting CBD parties and stakeholders for a series of webinars related to the monitoring framework. And one in that series will be on the ABS indicators. And the tentative date for that webinar on just the ABS indicators will be April 30th from 10 to 11 Montreal time or 4 to 5 here in Central Europe. So with that, the floor is back to the initiative, and I look forward to talking more about ABS and indicators at a later date.
Okay, yes, thank you very much, Amber. So with this, we've set the scene and we can move on to our panel discussion. So we've got Hervé Cadio, who is Deputy Manager at the Department of Epidemic Viruses at the Institut Pasteur in Abidjan, Ivory Coast, or Côte d'Ivoire. Melchior Kuo, who is Manager for Vaccines Policy at the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Associations in Geneva, Switzerland. Guilherme Oliveira, who is a Scientific Knowledge Manager at the Instituto Tecnológico Vale Sustainable Development in Belém, Brazil. And Dr. Alan Patton, who is Head of Science Collections at Kew Gardens in London, the UK. And Tim will tell you some more about each of the panelists, and then the panelists will tell you much more about all they know. So, Tim, please.
Thank you very much, Catherine. In fact, I'm going to begin telling you something about myself, and then more about the panelists. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Once again, my name is, Catherine mentioned, is Timothy or Tim Hodges, and I'll be facilitating the panel discussion, which will begin shortly. Let me, again, as I said, introduce myself a little bit more about my background, which is in multilateral diplomacy. I've been involved for my sins in ABS and DSI for a good number of years across a good number of forums, including in the CBD, where I played various roles, first as a negotiator, then as a head of delegation, and finally, ultimately, as a co-chair of the Nagoya Protocol negotiations. Also, of course, you will have seen, a number of you will have seen me in previous webinars, and it's a pleasure to be, once again, to be back. I should make it clear that any views that I express, and my apologies in advance for offering some views, but those views that I express are my own, and they don't belong to any particular institution. So Suhail has, I think, painted a very clear picture of the current broad sort of DSI policy landscape, supplemented by ably by Amber, and what's going on and what's being prepared and what will happen, at least in the short term. So it's useful, and I'll limit myself to just a few comments from a distance, somewhat from a distance, and just beginning with the term, actually, non-monetary benefit sharing. In my recollection, with the exception of the Nagoya Protocol and its predecessor, Bonn Guidelines, and probably to some extent the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, global discussions of these sorts of benefits, including, for example, how they are generated and shared and how they can be most effective, have really been neither extensive nor detailed, again, in my understanding. In fact, as some have noted, while the companion subjects of capacity building and development and technology and know-how transfer, I mean, those are useful catchphrases, the terms themselves, like non-monetary benefit sharing, convey very little about the nature and effect of these activities. I think everyone would agree, including stakeholders and negotiators alike, that it's absolutely critical to understand how non-monetary benefit sharing actually works, the range of approaches employed across sectors, the volume and values of the benefits generated and received, to know such things in advance of actually deciding what we're going to do in terms of achieving the broader policy goals, and partly mentioned by Suhail. I know that we have very limited time in this interim period for between CBD COPs, but as the saying goes, you must walk before you run. In preparing for this webinar, I went back through my notes recently and discussions with the ABS Capacity Development Initiative team. I'd written down in the margins of some of my notes the following: we don't know what is being done, and we don't know what can be done. We don't know what is being done, and we don't know what can be done. And this, of course, is the context of non-monetary benefit sharing. Now, I think that's only a slight exaggeration, but I think you get the point. If you don't actually know how something works, then you don't really know where you can go adequately and effectively. Amber mentioned the word categories in the context of indicators, and in fact, that does remind me that I think more frequently we've been hearing, and not just in the indicators context, but in the more broadly in non-monetary benefit sharing discussions, use of the term categories. I think the idea of establishing categories of non-monetary benefit sharing is not a new one. Don't think so. Although I don't think such categorization has ever actually been completed, at least certainly not to my knowledge. I suppose the idea is to create some kind of topology for non-monetary benefit sharing, which of course could be, I think, quite useful. Finally, one small point to make, and this is just an observation as a non-practitioner, and of course we will hear from the practitioners almost within the next minute or two. But it seems to me that in the context in particular of non-monetary benefit sharing, at least in the non-commercial world, as I understand it, it seems to be very relationship based. So institution to institution, researcher to researcher, researcher to communities. And some might describe that as a sort of bilateral model, but I think a better term might be in this case a relational model. And I suspect that at least equally trust and collegiality is as important as legal agreements and guarantees. So we don't need to talk about this today, but just in terms of going forward in the negotiations and policy making, and as we scale up commercial and non-commercial benefit sharing at the multilateral level, I think we'll need to keep this in mind. To more effectively use benefit sharing, the non-monetary benefit sharing approaches, then we'll need to be sensitive to the fact that it's very much relationship based. And of course, we don't want to mess with those relations. We want to enhance them rather than do the opposite. So we have some fresh faces on the panel today. Of course, they're very well known in their respective professional communities, but perhaps not as familiar to some of you here on the webinar. So we'll take just a few minutes to introduce our four panelists. And let me ask the four panelists to please put your cameras on. So let me begin with some introductions, and we'll do this in order of alphabetical order by surname. So that would mean first up in terms of introductions is Dr. Hervé Gageot. Hervé is Deputy Head of Department of Epidemic Viruses, Institut Pasteur, Côte d'Ivoire. He is head of the WHO Regional Reference Laboratory for Measles for West and Central African countries. He's been working on influenza and other respiratory viruses for more than 20 years at the Institute in Côte d'Ivoire, playing a major role establishing an influenza surveillance system and laboratory diagnostic capacity for respiratory infectious pathogens at both the national and sub-regional levels. He recently coordinated the molecular diagnostic activities as part of the national response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Gageot is a member of the French Society of Microbiology, the French Society of Virology, and the European Society of Clinical Microbiology and Infectious Diseases. So good of you to join us here today, Hervé. Bienvenue. Next, I would like to introduce Mr. Melchior Hua. His background is interestingly, in anthropology and international law. He works at the IFPMA, as we all know, the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Associations, which represents the innovative pharmaceutical industry at UN level, including at the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity. He co-leads the IFPMA's work on CBD and related ABS issues, including the Federation's engagement in relation to DSI negotiations, amongst other topics. Welcome, Melchior. Our third panelist is Dr. Guilherme Oliveira. He is a biologist who obtained a PhD from Texas A&M University. He works on the genetics and genomics of Amazonian biodiversity. And as mentioned earlier, Dr. Oliveira is currently the scientific director of the Vail Institute of Technology in the Brazilian Amazon. Thank you very much for joining us. Last but not least, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Alan Payton. Alan is head of science collections at Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew in London. He's responsible for the management and development of some 8.5 million science collections held at Kew in the herbarium, where we first met Alan, amongst other collections at Kew. Alan's published over, I'm told, 175 scientific papers related to collections, taxonomy, biodiversity informatics, and international policy related to implementation of the CBD. His current focus is on the digitization of Kew's collections. He's served on a good number of policy-related committees, such as the coordination mechanism for the Global Taxonomy Initiative, the CBD, a global strategy for plant conservation, among many others. Great to have you here, Alan. So once again, a warm welcome to all our panelists. We're very grateful that you've agreed to join us today for so generously offering to share not just your knowledge and your experience, but also your perspectives, and of course, your very valuable time. I should also note, and panelists, of course, are aware of it, that they will be speaking in their individual expert capacity, not necessarily representing their institutions or the countries from which they are speaking. We will have a number of rounds of quick questions and answers amongst the panelists before, as Catherine mentioned, we'll move to an open discussion with people who are registered here on this webinar. We'll begin with the first round, of course, being the first round, the initial round. And while we're going through this initial round, Catherine will be active in the background, doing a good number of things, including time management, and she will keep us on our toes, which will actually provide much more opportunity for all the registrants in this webinar to interact with the panelists further on. The first question for the panel may strike everyone as just a kind of warm-up question, but in fact, it's more than just a warm-up question. It's what I would call a foundational question. And with this first question, I'd like to give the audience a concrete sense, and myself, in fact, of what non-monetary benefit sharing actually looks like in a current professional context. So for the panelists, the question is as follows. In your sector or institution, what specific forms of non-monetary benefit sharing, what forms does it take? Can you tell us about the range of activities constituting non-monetary benefit sharing, and what the importance or magnitude of non-monetary benefit sharing is for your sector or institution? Each panelist, you'll have 2 minutes to respond, and we'll start with Hervé, followed by Alan, Guillermo, and Melchior. Hervé, you will be first to speak. And I would anticipate,
merci,
go ahead.
J'interviens ici.
And I'm taking the floor now as an expert in the health sector or human health sector. Now, with regards to non-monetary benefit sharing, there's a relation between the benefits, the producer, and the one that acquires. And if I give you the context that we have in Côte d'Ivoire in the Pasteur Institute, I must say that the capacity to produce digital sequence data is very much limited. There are maybe 2 or 3 laboratories that have the capacity to produce DSI. but there are important biological resources in the countries that are sent elsewhere to conduct diagnostics, and this allows us to conduct genomic analysis. This is generated abroad. But now, with regards to influenza, to give you a concrete example, we've established a mechanism to benefit from what has been done. For 20 years, we've shared data at the global level in terms of influenza surveillance. We try to find strains, vaccine strains, and so we gain some benefits through cooperation agreements with the CDC or agreements that are signed with the WHO. And so what does it entail? It is basically capacity building. So anything to do with sequencing was established through this benefit sharing agreement, this support that has been provided with the activities that we conduct on influenza and other respiratory disease. So it's rather a capacity building. That's the form it takes. That's the type of benefit sharing we've had. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Alan, please.
Thank you, Tim. Hello, everybody. So in my sector, it really focuses on basic research for conservation, evolution, and looking at patterns of sustainable use. And in that context, our partnerships are often project-driven, but we also have longer institutional level partnerships. And I think in that context, non-commercial benefit sharing falls into three main categories: people, data, and infrastructure. Thinking about people, there's obviously training, whether it's academic, formal degrees and supporting those, or technical, looking at methods, skills, often learning through the work itself. In the DSI context, that might be training in new techniques for genomic analysis, for example. Through that collaboration, joint publications, facilitation of visits to institutions, access to collections from other parts of the world, and also joint fundraising and grant applications. I think it's important to say that these relationships often begin with people. The relationship can be quite narrow at the beginning between people, and then it may blossom into more institutional levels. But the initial contact is often quite at a personal level. Thinking about data now, open access to data, so it can be combined with any data from other places, and making that freely available and published, and not training people to use that data and those resources. Sequence data as well can be packaged to appropriate tools. For example, it might be a genetic tool for identification, or identifying threatened plants in trade, in support of CITES, or conservation planning, for example. It might be trying to determine what the native population is as opposed to the introduced population. And finally, infrastructure, jointly creating facilities that might involve technical advice and materials for seed banking, for example, for conservation purposes, or it might be helping build collections and facilities for further study of biodiversity. I think all these areas are very important to collaborative science, and non-commercial benefit sharing is by far the most frequent form of benefit sharing in our sector. Commercial benefit sharing, in my perspective, is extremely rare in comparison to non-commercial, and as our work is focused on basic research and conservation, evolution, and sustainable use, at this research level, it's rarely commercially focused. And truly collaborative science can't really happen without non-commercial benefit sharing.
Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you. Guilherme?
Oh, thank you, Tim. It's a pleasure to be here with you and the panelists. So as we are also at a research institution, although it's a private nonprofit instance of a research institution. And in this context, On the context of this discussion, we have recently started a large-scale genomics and genetics study of the Brazilian biodiversity with the focus in the Amazon. So we're seeing genomes determining the genetic characteristics of species for conservation purposes and also to aid in the development of the bioeconomy based on local species. And also monitoring of species that are extracted from the environment like fish and crabs, and also to establish environmental DNA as a tool for biodiversity monitoring. So to do this, we partnered with the ICMBio. This is the Chico Mendes Institute for Conservation of Biodiversity. This is a federal institution. And through ICMBio, we have contact with IPLCs. Although we believe that just this contact is not sufficient for what we need to do, what we hear from them is that they want to be an integral part of this program and not just some people who we eventually consult. So we are working with them to bring them into the project, not only to enable training, but also to learn from them how to do it properly. This is another point that seems to be very important to us. So we want to conduct this project, obviously taking care of all of the legal considerations, but doing more and especially learn from the native people, originary people, how to do this respectively, and also considering their interests and operating with them so that they eventually can conduct the research that is of their interest. So for that, we established what Tim called the relational model, which is, I think, is really appropriate. But also we are potentially touching on all of the indicators that Amber mentioned earlier. So for us as an institution, this is really important because we are trying to transition from a model where we just learn from biodiversity and conduct research in a traditional manner to bring IPLCs into this project, to learn from them how we do it properly, respectively, and address issues and research gaps or problems that are relevant to them and not necessarily from our own perspective. And it is also very important to us, and this is why we established a local infrastructure, because we believe that although we want to do this as collaboratively as possible, not only in Brazil, but abroad as well, this is open. We believe that without the local infrastructure and the local resources to do it, we will never be able to fully address issues that are important to the country, to the region, and to IPLCs. So I will start with that, Tim. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Melchior?
Thanks a lot, Tim. Happy to be here. So I'd like to, many people touched on it, right? Non-monetary benefit sharing is quite a broad term. So I'm going to be speaking based on this perspective, right? You have capacity building, you have technology transfer, and you have many other different things that fall within that category. But I think something that hasn't been said yet is that actually the most fundamental benefit is the value of the products, speaking from a commercial sector, the value of the products that are created, because they do give a huge value to humanity, to society. You think about vaccines, medicines, new plant strains, etc. And even on a basic level, the fact that we can create these products and do more scientific research is also a non-monetary benefit for everyone. And then in the context of the DSI discussions, and I think Alan, you talked about this, is that DSI and access to DSI is also very clearly a form of non-monetary benefit sharing. The fact that we can have open access to data is really important. Now, beyond that kind of basic point, from a business perspective, there are many ways in which business engages in non-monetary benefit sharing as part of our responsible business practice or responsible practice more globally. They're not necessarily linked to the CBD or Nagoya Protocol or strict access and benefit sharing rules, but there are a huge amount of activities that are independent from the CBD system, which are just increasing in quantity and quality. There were two examples that I managed to find strictly linked to access and benefit sharing. They'll be well known to many here, which is the AstraZeneca and Griffith University collaboration, as well as the Merck InBio collaboration. Now, since then, the industry has been focusing on other forms of non-monetary benefit sharing, and this is largely due to the fact that most research undertaken, at least by the IFPMA sector, is that it's not linked to genetic resources in the CBD sense. It's more linked to pathogens or human genetic resources. Now, I've said there are a lot of different examples. I won't be able to run through all of them. We have a page which has over 315 different initiatives, which span a number of different categories. And I think I'll speak briefly to the different categories. You know, underlying all of these is the fact of building partnerships. So you've got some projects which are based on the donation of vaccines. You have a company which has been donating more therapies for leprosy since 2000 for all patients worldwide. Over 7.5 million people have been treated, and the global disease burden has been reduced by 95% for leprosy. You've got activities in terms of health system strengthening. You have companies that have trained thousands of health workers, increased climate change resilience for health systems, etc. And then, of course, you have manufacturing and transfer of technology agreements. Yeah. So broadly speaking, I think it's very sector specific, what you can see with these kinds of examples.
And thank you very much, Medico. We're running a little bit late, so I'll limit my in fact, I will not provide any commentary on this first round. It's been very interesting. It's tempting to just already pursue a number of the points you've made back to you, but I will discipline myself here. Let's go to quickly to our second round, and this next question goes beyond the current state of play and ask you, the panelists, to explore how non-monetary benefit sharing activities in your sector could be further optimized. So you've given, I think, all four of you have given us a pretty good understanding in a very brief period of time, you know, what it looks like in your sector or your institutions. But now we're going a little bit further and asking the question, based on your experience and knowledge in your institution or sector, are there any specific improvements that could be made to non-monetary benefit sharing activities, whether in terms of seeking alternative approaches or modifying current structures or procedures? So again, you'll have 2 minutes each, and we'll start with Alan. Alan, please.
Thanks, Tim. So thinking about the current limitations that we face, much of science funding is short-term and project-based. So some requests for collaboration can't really be met completely in a typical research cycle of 3 or 4 year period. And that can produce problems. For example, we may work with students from a particular country and train them in techniques and the use of DSI through to publication. But when they go home, they may not have access to the facilities to study in their own country. They may not have the technical computing capacity to run the bioinformatic pathways, and they may not really get to the position where they can become a trainer themselves of the things they've learned. And I think part of the reason for that is that personal link at the beginning. People start quite slow, quite small, and working at almost at a personal level. And our capacity to train and work and collaborate and build things is limited to our area of technical expertise. For example, for conservation seed banking, we kind of know how that works, and we can give advice and we can help build facilities. But use of DSI involves things like high-performance computing. It may involve established bioinformatic pipelines, but the people who are using them are simply using the tools and not developing them. So I think we need to really extend that initial relationship, which drove the initial access to genetic resources, to a broader relationship where other skills can be brought in to provide infrastructures and provide a more empowering legacy in the country where the collaboration is happening and where the work is happening and where the biodiversity is and needs to be conserved.
Thanks very much, Alan. Guilherme, please.
Yes, thank you, Tim. So some of the issues are similar to what Alan mentioned, but I'll point to a few others. There's a lot of possibilities for training, but and this is very positive, but I think there's little action on the infrastructure development in developing countries where most of the biodiversity rich areas are. Another point that I think is very important is the establishment of collaboration among biodiversity rich countries. And using the Amazon as an example, we see very little action in cooperation between countries like Peru, Colombia, and Brazil, for instance, as an example. So I think there's a lot that can be done in multilateral cooperations in these countries. And I stress the point of local infrastructure because still the data that is available for use for bioinformaticians or now with the new AI tools, especially generative AI use on molecular data, will not use data from biodiversity rich areas because it's not available. And I think that without the local infrastructure, we'll always study biodiversity from the perspective of the funders, which typically will fund training, but will not fund infrastructure. So it's on this responsibility is on the local governments to understand that without it, we will not leap into a new era where we produce products from biodiversity, but enabling ourselves to do it. So also the long-term projects are essential. This is not something that's going to be accomplished with the 2 to 3 year projects. And with all of this in mind is what we decided to do at the Institute, is to look at long-term funding for this project, establish local infrastructure, open the labs, not only to collaborators within Brazil and abroad. And also, I think, as I mentioned earlier, it's central to us to approach IPLCs in a proper manner and to have them co-develop this research with us. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you very much, Melchior.
Thanks a lot. So actually, in a way, I have something similar to say to what Guillaume and Alan said, but from a commercial perspective, is that you know, when you do capacity building, when you do all of these things, you have to ensure that there is the right ecosystem in place, the right infrastructure, and all of these things. And then when you talk about commercial products, in a way, you need to make sure that there is a sustainable market for these products in place. You need to ensure that the manufacturing facilities, the workers, the suppliers, etc., are all there and can continue to keep those, you know, those manufacturing plants running. Otherwise, the funding that goes into the training and with the setup costs, it doesn't work out. And then, I mean, in addition, I'd like to say that, you know, it's clear to me that there are very specific requirements for different types of non-monetary benefit sharing. When you're talking about building local capacity in manufacturing, it's very different from health system strengthening or from donating medicines. They're all very different types of projects. And then, you know, in addition, speaking to the CBD context, they're also very different from conservation and sustainable use. So it's clear that it's not a one size fits all. And then it's also, you know, it has to be tailored to the specific conditions of the community or the country, as well as the sector or the actors who are called on to do the non-monetary benefit sharing. Speaking from a pharmaceutical sector kind of perspective, you know, these companies are much better at making medicines than helping with conservation projects potentially. They're not necessarily the experts. So where their expertise lies is potentially where the capacity and the benefits can come from. So it would be like fitting, you know, a square peg into a round hole or something like that if you ask the wrong actors to do, you know, to do things which they're not experts in. Then I think, you know, I think broadly speaking, all of these different factors make it quite difficult to conceptualize how to bring non-monetary benefit sharing under a kind of multilateral system, but I think it's something that is worthwhile to continue thinking about. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And finally, Hervé, please.
Alors, moi, je dirais que c'est plus
Thank you very much. I think that training is necessary, should be emphasized, and more collaboration as well. I'll give you a practical example. A month ago, we have received support from the Robert Koch Institute in Germany. They came to help us about awareness about the significance of genomics for a country like us. So if we talk about the health sector, we have to do genomic surveillance and also integrated disease surveillance. And this will allow us to see what pathogens we are dealing with and then do proper sequencing. We will see what are the health issues of significance for our country and even internationally. And this is an initiative which was undertaken and which will allow us in future to have a legal framework to cope with it for genomic surveillance in Côte d'Ivoire, because we have to say that in developing countries we don't have anything like that. And if we want to be able to contribute, we need to have proper training, proper capacity building, and also to have proper infrastructure. And this is where we need more support so that we can contribute efficiently and we can also draw benefits from it. Thank you very much.
Merci, Hervé. Thank you very much to all the panelists. Well, certainly one theme among many, common theme recurring across the panel is the idea of sustaining activity over a period of time, among many other themes. So let's move quickly to the third round. This one may take the panelists somewhat out of their comfort zone, but this is not a surprise question to you because you've been given at least a few days to prepare. And it's not meant to be rude, but trying to push the envelope a little bit as the policymakers and the negotiators will certainly have to. I mean, it was mentioned how some things are rather challenging in terms of multilateral approach when in fact non-monetary benefit sharing is characterized by diversity, at least as I've understood. You tell me about it. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, there's an inherent tendency, at least in my mind, to sort of silo issues even when they're strongly connected, whether it's technology transfer and non-monetary benefit sharing, many examples within the CBD, within our own governments, just within the world we live in today. And certainly, absolutely, is the case in the CBD, including certain bilateral versus multilateral. Again, just to cite a simple example. But with the adoption of the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, I think it's clear, at least it's clear to me, that now we really have to build bridges across what used to be silos or very different areas. And this certainly be the case for non-monetary benefit sharing as well, including in the context of the multilateral mechanism for benefit sharing. So the question is this: from your personal expert perspective, what concretely could be done to enhance or bolster non-monetary benefit sharing to further support the CBD objectives, the 3 objectives, of course, and the current implementation commitments we have under the CBD involving, for example, the Kunming Biodiversity Framework, such as the, and also, of course, the multilateral mechanism for benefit sharing. So concretely, what could be done to enhance and bolster non-monetary benefit sharing to support the CBD's objectives and programs? We'll begin with Guilherme, please.
Yeah, sure, Tim. Thanks for the question. It's indeed one that gets us to scratch our heads. But I'll start with the issue of the multilateral mechanism that, for instance, Brazil is now has changed its position since the last COP and is in favor of the multilateral mechanism. But also within our negotiators are still looking at forms to establish bilateral benefits. And this is a difficult thing because currently the world doesn't work as we have one species one, let's say, enzyme in one product. Things are much more complex now with all the computational tools available to us. So I don't know exactly how this can work in that way, but something we need to do is to address people who have conserved this biodiversity and are providing us with the initial material to do this research. So I'll go back to my point and stress that I think the one thing that we can do is first establish whatever it will be the governance of how this benefit will be shared, so that how governance is going to work on this distribution of funds, and it should be on equal grounds to all countries involved. And it appears to me that some of the possibilities are not well balanced. And finally, however governance occurs, I think there should be a strong focus on enabling countries that have preserved their biodiversity and have are rich in biodiversity to enable these countries to conduct the research and eventually be able to produce or co-produce and participate in the production of products that then go back. I don't think just that the distribution of money will be sufficient. There are many ways of doing non-monetary benefit sharing, and I think I see some nice projects happening, but I think they are not going to enable these communities to leapfrog to a new economy that's in line with the conservation of biodiversity and use all these technologies. I think if we don't enable these countries, we're going to see differences continue to increase between rich and poor countries. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you very much, Naim. Again, my apologies to all the panelists for such a brief opportunity, but we're getting close to having fielding a lot more questions and you being able to respond. Melchior, please, you're next.
Great, thanks a lot, Tim. So on this question, I remember looking into my sector's, examples of access and benefit sharing, and at first I was shocked that there was hardly anything. And then only afterwards, when I realized that actually it doesn't mean that the sector isn't doing anything. As I said, there are many hundreds of examples of things that can be classed as non-monetary benefit sharing. It's just the fact that these things are happening for specific sectors in specific ways. There are already mechanisms set up. For the companies I work with, they work a lot with UNICEF, with WHO, with UNITAID and other UN institutions, not necessarily with the CBD. And there is already a huge amount of work and things that are being done, which we may not have visibility of in the CBD space. So we may feel like we need to, have strong rules to mandate or mandatory non-monetary benefit sharing and things like that. But I just urge caution around those kinds of ideas because of all the things everyone has said today, right? It's very personal. It's very, sector specific, actor specific, country specific, etc. And I think the best thing that can be done is finding a way of just making sure that what is happening, the good things that are happening, are further incentivized, through potentially enhancing actors' reputation, helping facilitate these kinds of projects and things like that, rather than having a too prescriptive approach, trying to really, push for things which happen organically anyway in many situations. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Hervé, s'il vous plaît.
Alors, sur ce point-là, j'ai essayé de comprendre un peu les mécanismes.
I try to understand what is being done already, what mechanisms exist already, but what I can say is that whatever needs to be done, there has to be some flexibility, some latitude for countries to use those benefits. Sometimes those benefits can only be used in a certain way, but sometimes the priority of the country are different. If I take the case of one benefit from an activity in a given sector, I should be able to use those benefits in a different sector. This kind of flexibility is very important and should be there. And also we have to avoid to kill research. We have to find a balanced approach so that the country benefits, the organization benefits, and the researchers also benefits, because sometimes it's only the institution benefiting. So we have to avoid, for instance, frustrating researchers, because they should also get some benefits. So this is what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, merci, Hervé. Finally, Alan, over to you.
Thanks, Tim. I think the current small-scale relationship model will struggle to build sufficient DSI capacity to the new techniques, the complex analysis, and so everybody can fully benefit from opportunities of DSI. I think to fully benefit, there has to be an accessible infrastructure to answer different questions and inspire new questions other than just the questions which arose from which the access was initially driven by. We need to extend that relationship from initial researchers involved to reaching out to others who's interested in developing bioinformatic infrastructure to answer a much broader range of questions, not just those original questions. So I think that isn't going to happen without some coordination. It needs those wider relationships to kind of provide that infrastructure and training. And how do we do that? How do we pull the resources together in any country to really provide an infrastructure which is sufficient to meet the needs of that country? I think we have to do something now. I think we can talk about it so far, but I know it's from one of Amber's slides. I think that learning lessons from experience is important. So I would like, even if we do some small scale initial case studies as to how you can provide a more flexible and sustainable infrastructure for examining and working with DSI in a country, a biodiverse country, would be really useful. Mm-hmm. And a multilateral system with benefit sharing, not only linked to that initial access event, might provide some of the means to help extend and coordinate those relationships to build these infrastructures.
Thank you very much, Alan, and thank you, panelists, for a very interesting and slightly out on a limb round. Well, I've been listening to you, and I see the chat. We've got 81 messages in the chat. I haven't been following that. I've been listening to you, panelists, as I should have been. And it's good to see the level of activity that's occurred on the chat. We're now going to move to opening this up, exposing you panelists to questions and some themes that have emerged and are emerging in the chat and elsewhere. So it's with Catherine, over to Suel and Hartmut to have collaborated and collated some ideas for you, the panelists, to address.
Thank you, Tim. Just very briefly to explain how this works. So Hartmut and Suel have been going through the chat and looking at issues coming up there and questions, and they will present some of them, as many as we can, to the panel, and then we see whether all or some of you from the panel will reply. That will depend. I think Hartmut is going to start, and I would like to invite Hartmut then also to turn on your camera while you are speaking, and I'll turn mine off.
There was interesting comment by Patricia from Argentina, and it relates a bit, at least in my understanding, to the general confusion or problems people have to understand what could be non-monetary benefits shared in the context of a multilateral system, because the usual experiences of users are that they shared in a more bilateral approach, direct approach. And I think what Patricia asked or suggested is if there couldn't be an international mechanism under this beneficiary mechanism that then would undertake this non-monetary benefit sharing. So that would be something in the end which would then not be undertaken by the individual users to share their benefits, but by the mechanism. So I think it might be an interesting idea, also maybe related to other multilateral funds which provide benefits. Well, I think that question I would like to pose to panelists or to those who like to answer, if they can imagine that such a international mechanism would might be suitable for solving these questions we have.
Thanks, Hartmut. We'll open up to the panel, and thank you, Patricia, in Buenos Aires, for which is a major question. I think it's been touched on by a number of the panelists, if not all of them. We don't need to go around the entire panel unless everyone wants to take a shot at this. I'm certain that some will want to address it, but this is obviously a very big question. Maybe Alan, maybe to go to you first, not put you on the spot. Anything further to add? Because in fact, you did address this to some extent.
Yeah, I think an international body could well be part of the solution. I think that it would need perhaps some regional or country input to identify the needs and identify the solutions which would suit that country. I think it has to be practical, non-bureaucratic, but I do think that some level of collaboration is necessary, and I'm not sure at what level that coordination would work best. Would it work better at a regional level than a global level, for example, where the body kind of implementing the general support would be closer to stakeholders? But yeah, I just think we do need to look at different options, and that I think is probably worth trying. I've got my slight worry is it's too remote from the end user, and what sort of system would you have to have in place in order to identify and prioritize the need, and maybe something closer to the end user, either at a country level or a regional level, might be better than a fully global coordination organism.
Thanks very much, Alan. Anyone else?
Yeah, I can pitch in with a couple of additional points. I think it may be a good thing to have an international resource for this, but I think that wherever these facilities or instances are located, they need to involve local people deep in the governance of this. Otherwise, I don't think it will be incorporated into the regional way of doing things. It'll be just an additional external source, which everyone is welcome. But I think without local governance, this will tend to go on a tangent and not address local needs and issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Certainly a theme that I'm quite interested in, not just in terms of non-monetary benefit sharing, but biodiversity, policy and conservation, from the local to the global, and in return, from the global to the local. Highly important, obviously. Anyone else on this, or we move to another question?
Maybe just very, very quickly. I think I think the focus on incentivizing is completely right, and I think Alan and Guillaume kind of touched on it in a way, is that, you know, there's the risk that this could become too bureaucratic, too burdensome if it is too rigid and it tries to achieve too much. I think this kind of idea needs to be a relatively light touch, so to speak, and a kind of maybe a matchmaking platform or something, you know, which helps and creates a bit of awareness around what is happening, can be quite beneficial for both, to create some visibility around the good things that are being done or can be done.
Thanks very much. Hartmut, let's maybe Suel, have you
yes.
got something for us?
Yeah, there are couple of topics, of course, popping up, and one that has been touched upon by many is this question on indigenous peoples and local communities. Knowing that Preston will still speak, but it would be good to hear maybe from our panelists what kind of ways they see that the needs, the voices, the desires of IP and LCs could be accommodated in a new multilateral benefit sharing system. Guillermo already made some links to those, but as there seems to be common sense that key beneficiaries should be IPLCs. Based on your experiences also in collaboration, how could that look like? So just some food for thought in that regard, maybe.
Let's get to it.
Okay, I can get the ball rolling. So one thing that concerned me recently when I was discussing this issue with an indigenous woman was that she brought to my attention that even from the beginning, how we approach the species in our ecosystems is not completely accounting in the respect for this species in the perspective of IPLCs, not in my own perspective, because which is more legalistic or so. So this is something that we should be concerned with from the beginning, and perhaps that will create this relationship where we co-create the approach on how we, at the other end, bring the benefit back, because it's not up to me to decide what it's best for these people. It's up to them to tell me or tell us. So I think bringing them on board and establishing this this relationship with the utmost respect and accountability for what we do in science as we do it would be a good starting point. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. You've certainly got the ball rolling. This is very interesting. Anyone else on this? It's a big question, a really central one, obviously. And we will hear. Go ahead, please.
I think part of how do you get IPLC's needs expressed so that they can access whatever funding may be available. And I think there has to, as part of this picture, there probably has to be some in-country level of light touch governance as well to ensure that whatever comes down from the central multilateral fund, whatever it is, can get translated into a way where people can actually access it. And that will be different in different places. And so I do think it probably needs some layers of governance, bearing in mind, coming back to what Melchior said, is it's got to be fairly simple and fairly straightforward. Otherwise, we won't actually spend all our time tying ourselves up in laws, rules, and administration.
Thank you, Alan. I don't know if Melchior or Hervé, you have anything to add. Obviously, it's you know, you both in fact talked about local as well, and that important connection. I just to volunteer an obvious maybe observation that we've got the on the ground perspectives and needs of indigenous and peoples and local communities. And I think what I'm hearing is that needs to not just be taken into account at some juncture, but actually at the beginning, right, when you're shaping things. But there are the layers, of course, and not just at the international level, but there's also the national, the central government layers, which can prove problematic in some jurisdictions for indigenous peoples. And this is not a comment on those governments, but rather just the reality of a good number of layers which act as not deliberately necessarily, but as filters or interference in terms of getting the direct understanding of what is needed and what could be effective and helpful for indigenous and local communities in their pursuit of not just well-being, but also of conservation as well and sustainable development. That's just merely my own perspective on this. All right. And of course, we will, as we reminded, we will be hearing from Preston Hardison before the end of this panel. He's going to give us some reflections, as Catherine mentioned. And Preston, just a heads up, I think I indicated earlier that you would have 10 minutes. I'm afraid that you'll only have 5 minutes. So be ready, Preston. Thanks. Right. Let's go back to Hartmut or
Next would
Sewell.
be Hartmut, I guess.
Yes, so I'm back. Well, another topic which came up, and I think which also relates to a long discussion we have, is the example of Melchior when he mentioned that there is an inherent benefit sharing in, let's say, medicines that increase health, etc. That is an example or similar examples we hear a lot. But when we actually see what the CBD is, how the CBD is understanding benefit sharing, is actually to share the benefits that accrue to a certain user. Yeah, not to talk about societal benefits from research, but distinct benefits from a user that should be shared. So that is also what who was it? Jürgen was alluding to, that there are, of course, obligations under the CBD, etc., and you have this benefit sharing principle. So I think that would be also interesting to see, especially maybe also from the industry view, whether there is, let's say, additional efforts or new money going into this benefit sharing mechanism.
Yeah, happy to jump in. So I think it's a complicated question, and I think what I'd say is that there are a number of things that industry is doing that do constitute non-monetary benefit sharing, but not necessarily under the aegis of the CBD. I can only speak from the perspective of the sector I work for, because I don't have the experience in the other sectors. But it's, you know, the things that the companies do. There are a number of different things that are done which directly benefit populations. You know, I mentioned a few of them: donation of vaccines, building manufacturing facilities, all of these kinds of things, right? Which are not necessarily understood under the CBD context as non-monetary benefit sharing, yet they are things that industry is doing, which are capacity building, technology transfer, etc., etc. Now, in a way, it would be strange then for the CBD to ask for that. Well, for other UN institutions and other local communities, etc., and countries to get that on one side, and then to say, well, actually, hang on, in the CBD context, we want something else. We want further conservation and sustainable use. To me, it doesn't necessarily make sense to say, well, sure, you've given many medicines and you've helped to upskill and you've trained healthcare workers, but you haven't done anything for the biodiversity. You need to do something now for biodiversity as well. I think there's a bit of a disconnect there, because, you know, we talk about ecosystems in the CBD. We need to think about the whole global ecosystem when we think about policies too. So that maybe not completely answering your question, but I think that there needs to be recognition that there are many things that are done, and sectors and actors can all contribute different things to this. It doesn't make sense to say each sector has to do the same thing, or each actor has to do the same kind of non-monetary benefit sharing.
Thanks very much, Melchior. I imagine we can go to the to another question or observation, and Sewell?
Yes.
Yeah. Given the experience now of the panelists, and I would maybe focus on one thing that goes a little bit into the direction which things first, because some of you mentioned trainings, others also the question of infrastructure, and there is one specific comment in the chat whether or not one should focus on infrastructure first, because this would then help to bring them on board that are not on board yet. And then, of course, capacity development would be a subsequent or later element. Now, how do you see this now from your collaboration experiences? Is there a need really to focus in the first place on infrastructure, or is this capacity development, how to deal with infrastructure, basically equally or more a priority?
Please.
Yeah, I don't see how to disconnect these two things. You can ramp up infrastructure as you're training people, and just to train people without giving these people the opportunity to exercise what they were trained on, I think we're going to lose this very quickly. So what I think we should do is create training opportunities and ramp up infrastructure as we move along. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Can I just add to that? So I agree with Guillaume. However, I think the thing we're struggling with in my sector is creating the things which are slightly removed from the initial question and the initial access. It's how do you, for example, get high performance computing into university to allow people to use the tools they've learned elsewhere. And those tools aren't necessarily complex, they're kind of established bioinformatic pathways which have been developed in other fields and brought in. So we're kind of like, how do you kickstart some of that infrastructure that would then enable the trained people to sustain that training and become trainers themselves with the capacity in country? And maybe one way is to think about, you know, visiting fellowships or even visiting companies who use that kind of infrastructure in their data life, who can advise and set up and act as mentors or supporters of that infrastructure in country to allow people to be trained on it. And I think at the moment we could carry on as we are, and we just build capacity in the areas where the researchers are comfortable, and we might not get to the difficult bit of making that infrastructure sustainable. So I think we have to figure out some way of getting at that point. And I think that's probably where the multilateral thing could come in. It's like, how do you break that current barrier to sustainable progress?
But both of you have indicated that this is not an impossibility, obviously. So that's that buoys me a little bit. This is I hate to move to another question because I think I'd like to pursue this one, but because I think you're trying to grapple which concretely with what we will need to grapple with, and that's matching reality and actually being positive, constructive. Yeah, I think Hartmut, you're next in the queue.
So I think we have a last final question. I think then I go back to the very old topic. Is it mandatory or not? That was always a huge question. It was mentioned in the chat. Well, I think many of us have a certain understanding. If monetary benefit sharing would be mandatory, then somehow somebody had to pay money into a fund. Yes, so that's something we can comprehend. But how could this relate to non-monetary benefit sharing to be mandatory under a multilateral system? That is something where actually also I self have a certain, I need certain support in thinking and development on that. So might be a good question for the end of the round of the panel. Thank you.
Or it might not ever end the discussion. Actually,
Yes.
no. This is a good one. I have to say. So who on the panel, if anyone wants to tackle this important question?
I can have an attempt, but Hartmut, I don't think I'll give you the answer that you want. So I think you know, from what I said, and I think from what a lot of people here today said, is that it's, at least my understanding is that a mandatory non-monetary benefit sharing system wouldn't really work, simply given because of the fact that it's so specific based on the type of non-monetary benefit sharing, based on the communities, based on the actor giving it, based on the situation, based on the needs, and all of the different factors, which would make it incredibly difficult to set up a mandatory system for this. Yeah, so that's the very short answer and my perspective on that. Sorry, it may not be satisfactory.
We're in danger of having a dialogue between the organizers and the panelists, and that too is a good thing, because we're all on the same page trying to do the right thing on very complex set of issues. Anyone else on this particular question? If not, that we may be able to squeeze one more question in before we have President Allen.
I think if mandatory might eventually be part of the picture somehow, someplace, but I think we could probably do a lot now, doing something voluntary, and what would that look like? And I think that might give us a step up. I think there's a danger we just sit and fret and not do anything. And I think we have to get some case studies, get some lessons together.
Right. Okay. That's clear. Okay. Let's go to Suel. I think we can squeeze in one more question. Suel?
All right. I mean, it's a technical one, but I think one which may have some impact then in thinking things through. And this is if we considered now training, capacity development as an issue, and of course that would come along with the sharing data. There might be some issues then on IP and proprietary claims. And there was one specific question that was already making reference also to WHO. So I'm wondering now from the experience, maybe Melchior or Hervé, but of course also Guillermo and Alan, if there is training, if there is collaboration, if there's benefit sharing, non-monetary, how does one deal with that, with the IP questions and the proprietary questions in that regard? Because this will be an issue. I know it sounds not very technical, but I think we should face it, and having now probably your experiences to share would be good to get some of your views.
Thanks, Suel.
Or is the potato too hot?
Yeah, go ahead, Alan.
I was going to say that at the moment, we don't do that much commercial work, but we would approach it in a step-by-step way, in that you would initially get prior informed consent to do the basic work, and then if a commercial opportunity arose, you would have to go back and renegotiate PIC to do that bit of work. I think the problem with DSI is once the DSI is there may be commercial developments which don't have that PIC to do that piece of work. And how then can you make sure that any tools or things arising from that data resource, the benefits go back to where the material came from, which, as we know, is difficult, and hence multilateral system. I do think that you have to identify what might be required to get intellectual property, and quite often, certainly in the plant world, you need to have material to really commercially exploit, which would mean access to physical material as well, quite often. And at that point, you could negotiate prior informed consent for commercial development. And I think that's a bit which if we could make more transparent the use of the data and the development of that data towards commercial enterprise, and that this might need the input of WIPO to do it, you could then ensure that there is some new prior informed consent which might lead to commercial development. But it's difficult because it's difficult to, I think, without WIPO spotting where the patents are coming and feeding that information and making that information transparent, it would be quite a difficult system to implement. So I do think we might need WIPO input to do this bit.
Thanks, Alan. I'm sure there must be at least one other panelist would like to say something on this.
Yeah, sure. I wouldn't be too concerned about the actual intellectual property until it becomes revenue for a company. And that's where I think the trigger is, or if it's a secret or whatever. I mean, if you develop a product, there's a multilateral system that you can then contribute to. The other thing that at the other point was when you access the genetic resource. I mean, if you're accessing it from indigenous people, in that negotiation, you may bring something of benefit to these people, so you can have access to it. And we have to remember also that with the technology that we have currently today, if company decides to make an agreement with a country or with a tribe or whatever, this company may be able to produce as much data as we do in the research world, not have it public, and then develop a product. So it's real now. I'm not sure how this can be dealt with unless these companies will strike some negotiation at the beginning of accessing the biodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Clock is ticking. We're meant to move to the reflections part of the panel. Anyone else, if you've got to share immediately a reaction, if not, we'll move. Right. Thank you. Go ahead.
It may be a good time now to get some reflection, especially from the a representative of IPLC now. So
yep. Thank you,
in order
Catherine.
to not put up the slide again, maybe Tim, Preston's full name, etc., will be on the slide to be shared later on, but maybe you just want to introduce. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine.
And thanks to the panel.
Yes, thank you very much to the panel. Very grateful for all of your time and your perspectives. And I have also been taking notes, so I've really gained from this. All right, let's move to Preston Hardison. I think many of you will have heard of Preston, if not have met Preston. And Preston, thank you very much for your patience. I'd like to ensure that you, Preston, have your camera on, if not immediately, very soon. So Preston he's a co-lead negotiator in DSI for the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, the IFB. He's participated in negotiations of the CBD since COP3 in 1996, which I think was in Buenos Aires, and supported the IFB negotiators in the negotiation of the Nagoya Protocol, and served as an IIFB observer on the compliance committee of the protocol in its first two years. He's also served as negotiator in the Indigenous Caucus of the WIPO intergovernmental meetings since its inception all the way back to 2001, and it continues. He continues, I believe, in that role. Finally, before retiring from the Tulalip tribes of Washington in the U.S. in 2020, he worked on developing similar guidelines for the use by U.S. federal agencies on the use, of traditional knowledge in climate change actions. So, Preston, I'm really very grateful for you, for your patience, and for your willingness to share with some reflections on what you heard today here, please. So, over to you, Preston, and good morning.
Great. First, I'd just like to ask, can I paste my notes into the chat, because I had so many good notes. You can use them. I'll make comments on them, but I think they might be useful to send around to people, if that's okay.
I don't see anyone saying no.
No? Okay, here we go. Well, maybe not. I'll try to get them in there. Okay, so in 5 minutes, I can't do much. So very quickly, on Amber's presentation of the 5 categories, most of these are framed in terms of in-kind or coupled approaches. So the industry provides benefits in the form that it can provide it. And I'll have some words to say on this. And it's very difficult for me to see how the bucket of sustainable development will be sufficient to support Indigenous peoples or local communities. And again, we really should be careful here. As we said, many have said here, Indigenous peoples and local communities must be involved in developing these categories. They're worried about what has been called in the literature epistemological violence. They're interested in building their own data sovereignty systems. These approaches really must include them in deciding categories before proposing international standards. I really feel very strongly for this. I think the non-monetary benefit sharing technology must be directly targeted at the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. There needs to be substantial benefits on the ground. It should be linked to the entire Kunming Global Biodiversity Framework. In other words, it should contribute to reducing threats, meeting people's needs, and providing tools and solutions. And again, this is partly because we are moving from a bilateral system in which those who are having the bilateral contracts, really the industry can only provide non-monetary benefits within its capacities. But once we get into serving the entire framework, we have many more avenues. We have to worry a bit about who are providing the non-monetary benefits. Again, it's not bilateral anymore. There's the issue of voluntary and additional versus mandatory and enhancing. I don't see that these are just, necessarily contradictory. They can both exist. I would say I heard the comment about the mandatory is localized and specific, but I also believe that still is trackable. Just because they're specific doesn't mean we can't come up with a reporting system and some indicators on other types of institutions. We have again, as I said, coupled or in kind versus decoupled and out of kind, and I have a strong rationale for thinking a little bit outside the box. There's the benefits that are provided by industry, researchers, and businesses, but there's also the ones that are provided by the projects, the fund, and then there's the benefits that can be provided by the mechanism as a whole. So we need to distinguish actor benefits, the project benefits, and the mechanism benefits. On matchmaking, yes. I think there is an interest in matchmaking. And again, indigenous peoples and local communities need to be figured as agents with their own agency, as opposed to clients or clientele or stakeholders and so on. They have their own agency and they are interested in building their own capacities. On regionalization, we are willing to engage in those discussions. We do agree that there needs to be some kind of governance. And as we've said, indigenous peoples are looking for having a role in deciding priorities without political interference, and also direct funding in the future. And finally, we have a strong support for open and responsible data governance as a form of benefit sharing. And again, if people are interested, I spent a couple of weeks going through the non-monetary benefit sharing literature, and I have compiled a several thousand long list. Now, of course, we can't deal with all those several thousand things, but I think there's a wide range of things. For example, reducing harms, removing pressures, and so on is an important part of benefit sharing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Preston, and personal. Please forgive me for asking you yet again to bridge your remarks again, but you never disappoint, and you've given us so much here today. So thank you for your reflections and for getting up so early on the west side of this hemisphere. So we now move to closing up the webinar, and I'd say goodbye to everyone, and I move the microphone over to Catherine and then to some closing remarks. Thanks very much. Thank you again, Preston.
Thank you very much, Preston, and thank you very much, Tim. Preston, you mentioned that you've got some comments. You can, of course, paste them in the chat, but since the webinar is about to close, people might not be able to read it. you may perhaps also send them to the team directly, and then we can include them in the report and people can read them at their time and quietly and not rushed. So thank you very much for this. And I think maybe I would just like to highlight briefly, so I will hand over to Hartmut once again, but as you go leave the webinar later on, please take a minute. I think it doesn't take much longer to fill in the evaluation that we have here, which is very valuable for us always to know what your impressions were. With this, thank you very much for your interest, for your time, for listening. Thank you to all the panelists and to the team. And I hand over to Hartmut.
Yes, thank you. Well, I will be short. Yeah, it's time is over, and I thank the panelists for their valuable input. I thank Preston for his remarks. We are in contact, of course, and I think we will reflect that in the report. And I thank Tim for his facilitation in a very good way again. And I also would like to thank the interpreters for their work, although this time we had some technical glitches, but I hope that will be better in the future. Well, you will hear more from us. There will be more webinars. We will also be present at the next CBD negotiations, give side events, or be there in person, so that we will follow this topic together with other players in the field to COP16, where we hopefully get a good result on this and hear about the modalities for that system. And before I close, I also would like to thank our new donors who came in. So apart from Norway and of course the German government, it is the government of Great Britain and the government of the Netherlands which are supporting the initiative now. That's great, and that enabled us to do even more work on DSI and on all the other ABS topics. Well, thanks for that. So we will publish the report and also the video on our webpage in, let's say, in due time when it is ready. Thanks a lot and see you next time. Okay.
Thank you very much, Hartmut, and goodbye, and thank you to everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.